You're with Joel Rheinberger on ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania.
What's on your bucket list for an overseas holiday? Maybe you're a culture lover, so touring the Louvre or seeing a symphony. Maybe you're an adventurer, so you're going to be riding rapids. Maybe you like a lazy holiday. I don't mind them, so beaches and Mai Tais and local food. They're all great ways to approach a trip, but what sort of holiday has you crawling through a sewer pipe? My colleague Andy Cunningham has just come back to Tassie after a trip to Europe. He's an Englishman, so he was visiting his homeland, but he also toured a sewer pipe and found out what it's like next door to a war. Andy, good morning to you.
Very good morning to you, Joel.
Now, what was the original purpose of your trip?
The original purpose was to visit my family, which, due to COVID, I hadn't seen for nearly 4 years. And my mum hasn't been in the best of health, so yeah, it's really to get back to the UK. But I also went to Poland to visit a friend who used to work here, in fact, Yannick Frankowski, who's a cameraman who's originally from Poland but has now retired back there.
Now, what were the highlights of England for you? How was it seeing your mum?
Well, that was interesting. She's got dementia and lives in a care home near London. And when my brother picked me up and we went to visit her, it was quite amusing walking into the reception area. And it coincided with her being wheeled down the corridor right in front of us, and she was shouting at the staff, "They don't know what they're doing." And then my brother Ian said, "Oh, hi, Mum. I've got Andy from Australia here with me." And she initially said, "Who's that?" And he said, "Oh, it's Andy from Australia." And she said, "I don't know any Andy from Australia." But I was wearing a mask. We were both wearing masks, and she was quite flustered, obviously. So we took her into a room, and I pulled out a bottle of Tasmanian whiskey, and that smoothed things over for the last 4 years of not seeing. So a couple of drams later, all was right in the world.
Now, you went for a tour on a canal boat. Is that actually fun?
It is great fun. My brother used to own one, and he was quite familiar with them. And we went to a little place called Rugby, you may have heard of.
Oh, yes.
It's actually on the the Great Union Canal that links London to Manchester. And it's just a different pace of life, and there's lots of lovely pubs to visit. We basically had a long weekend on one with my both brothers and a couple of other friends. And the highlight of that was actually a little pub called The Folly. And they actually had a map of the world on the ceiling. And I invited people to pin a tag on where you came from. And I was the first person to pin a tag of Tasmania. So that was quite fun. But we ended up having a sing-song till 2 a.m. With some of the locals, and it was a lot of fun.
Let's get to the crux of things. You went to Poland.
Well, that's right. I've got a good friend who I used to, fellow cameraman Yannick, who was quite a character, or is quite a character, and he invited me to come and visit him. And I actually booked the trip long before Putin decided to mess things up, and I thought, well, I'll be damned if he's going to ruin my holiday. And I was my mother-in-law freaked out when she knew I was going, and I thought, well, Poland's part of NATO. I think I'll be okay, but I'll certainly, be on the first flight out of there if things are not okay.
Yep.
And he did say to me, look, if things look really dodgy, I'll tell you, and I'll tell you not to come. But in fact, before I even got to Poland, I nearly didn't go because my mum had all sorts of health issues, and I accompanied her in an ambulance. I did 3 separate trips in ambulances to Watford General Hospital, and they allowed me to sit next to her in the ambulance. And on the second occasion, she had COVID. But once we got to the hospital, they wouldn't let me see her, and they wouldn't let anyone see her. So I thought, well, if I can't see her, I may as well still go to Poland. And it was only a 2-hour flight from London. So I said to Yannick, look, if things change, I'll just have to jump on a flight and come back.
2-hour flights in Europe are cheap, aren't they?
God, it was something like $50 one way. It was just ridiculous. On Wizz Air.
Now, what sort of things did Yannick take you to see in Poland?
Well, I arrived in Warsaw, and the first thing he did was take me to a restaurant, and he ordered pierogi, which is like dumplings, and we had a beer and, of course, a shot of vodka to start the trip. So we had 2 days in Warsaw and saw some really interesting things. The thing that really sticks in my mind there is the Uprising Museum that's related to the Second World War. And the two things in that museum that really stick in my mind, the first thing was a short film that they were showing at the end of World War II, was shot from an aeroplane, and the whole of the city was just in ruins. You know, you could not imagine it. And it was known as the most destroyed city on earth. That might have changed more in more recent times. And the strange thing is, you walk outside and you look down these wide boulevards and grand palaces and what look like beautiful old buildings, but of course they're almost brand new. And that really messed with my mind, because it's not something you really expect. But the city is absolutely beautiful, and they've got squares, wide boulevards, and the sort of Regency-style buildings. The other thing that they had on display was a mock-up of the sewers, because at the end of the war, the Polish resistance used to use the sewers as a way to move around the city, of trying to avoid the Germans. And they were used for transportation, communication, and evacuation. And you crawl into one, and they're about 1.5 meters high, and I was reading up about them yesterday. The smallest one was about 1 meter high. And you're in a perfectly clean, well-lit tunnel, but I still felt really claustrophobic.
Yeah.
And as it turns out, Yannick's father used to go through these as a 10-year-old during World War II, but he never spoke to Yannick about it. It was only after he passed away that his best friend told him what he'd done, and I think it was quite an experience to be in there, and of course they had to avoid the Germans, because they cottoned on later on during the war. That's what the Polish were moving from district to district, and they used to throw grenades down there and try and gas them out, and also flood them. So they had to be really quiet. And the amazing thing was, there was apparently little sort of markers that you could feel to tell you which direction you were going. So yeah, I mean, imagine most of it was done in the dark. And I can't imagine crawling through sewage to do that.
Now, while we're talking about the Second World War, you also went to Auschwitz, which is the scene of some of the greatest crimes against humanity ever.
Yeah.
How was that for you?
Well, it's very intense. It's as bad as you could imagine. But also, was going through my mind, particularly at the time I visited, it feels like history was repeating itself next door in Ukraine, and I did feel quite guilty about being there and just, swanning around with my mate, having a few drinks and going to lots of places. But yes, you do realise. The extent of it was quite shocking, because Auschwitz was originally a Polish military base that was converted to a concentration camp. And then they built Birkenau 3 kilometers away, and the railway line just sort of went between the two. And Birkenau was absolutely huge. That was like quite amazing to see the remains of that. But yeah, it was certainly a very intense experience, and I probably hadn't thought about it until Yannick mentioned it. But it was something. I'm glad I went, but it's something that's not an easy thing to do.
You're listening to ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania. I'm Joel Rheinberger. With us is my colleague, Andy Cunningham, who's an ABC cameraman. And we're talking about his recent trip to Poland because, right next to a war zone, Andy. What effect did that have on the Poles?
Well, it's an interesting question. They've taken in something like 3 million refugees, which is a staggering number. But, they're hugely supportive of Ukraine. Everywhere you go, there's Ukrainian flags, there's official supportive posters on tram stops, and there's unofficial graffiti with some less than polite words about Mr. Putin, and some posters, just saying, warning Russia's trying to invade and this kind of thing. But if you didn't watch the news and you sort of blanked out the flags, you really wouldn't think there was anything going on so close to their border. But at the end, I felt I needed to speak to a Ukrainian person because you just wouldn't know who was who when you're walking down the street. When we were in Warsaw, Yannick did say he did hear a lot of Russian voices and a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian, so obviously a lot in Warsaw. But we did, through a friend of Yannick's who'd been helping a Ukrainian woman with her 2 kids when the outbreak of war. So she came and I did a sort of interview thinking maybe we could, I could write up about it. But sadly, she left her coal miner husband behind. And she said, I've got no idea what the future is, and I've no idea when I'll see him again. So, yeah, it was pretty tough.
And Putin turned off the gas supplies while you were there.
He did, yeah. And again, the Poles seemed remarkably relaxed of such a drastic thing to happen. Luckily for them, 8 years ago, they decided they would get an alternative gas supply, so they did a deal with Norway, and as luck would have it, excuse me, the pipeline will be ready in October, which is incredible timing, and also their gas storage is at 80%, and heading into summer, that was not really a big issue for them. So, yeah, they've lucked out with their planning, or you could say it was good planning.
Andy, great to speak to you this morning. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you.
Andy Cunningham, ABC cameraman, and occasionally he's someone you might see in front of the camera as well. Occasionally he does the job of a journo standing in front of a camera, as well as being behind them. You are listening to ABC Radio Hobart and ABC Northern Tasmania.